I'm going to talk a bit about memory, and I think memory is something that concerns a lot of us at all stages of our life. And we have this feeling like it's changing, but we don't know quite how. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. My I only got into studying technology and memory relatively recently, maybe 10 years ago, because all my students were so much interested. They dragged me into it. I used to study basic mechanisms with forgetting and how forgetting is a good thing, how it's a good part of how we remember, that we need to forget to move on and to have selective access to things that are going to be most useful. But what I started to realize with this area of work is this kind of forgetting may not be that adaptive. And so it is a bit of a difference there. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I like to just define things. Like, what do I mean by memory? We tend to think of memory as remembering names or phone numbers or lists of facts. And in some sense, that is memory, and that's often how we might study it or talk about it. But for all practical purposes, memory is a lot more. It's the cognitive processes by which we construct and experience the past. So when we remember something, we're not playing a videotape. It's not a tape recorder. We are using cognitive processes to construct some representation of what we think happened. And we are re-experiencing it, kind of like a mental time travel event, full of falseness, and it's a constructive process, and it's not replaying reality, but that's what we do. And we just believe that it's true. It's also can be thought of as the influence of the past on the present or future, right? So we have evidence that there's memory because we behave differently based on what happened in the past. And that's an important part of how memory works. So a lot of memory is unconscious and implicit of how it impacts us and how we develop expertise, how we decide to vote, the ideas we come up with. All of that is evidence of prior experiences that make up memory. And memory also allows us to adapt, to learn, and to build expertise. It's it's an iterative process as we develop these things. So it's much more than just bits of facts or bits of items. It's this complicated part of our cognitive architecture. In terms of learning, and I'm going to talk about memory as creating new knowledge that we have in our head. One thing that it's important to point out is that repetition and rehearsal are not enough. So, there's this intuition that you just need to be exposed to something enough times and you'll remember it. But research shows that you could be exposed to a given fact or an item or an experience 1,000 times and you still won't remember it. Famous studies are like, if you ask someone to identify a penny from a lineup, even after a lifetime of use, they can't. Or people who have Apple products, they can't identify the Apple logo out of a lineup of similar logos. You know the gist. You know there's an apple, but do you know where the curve is? Do you know which way the stem's pointing? Do you know which side the bite is on? No, you don't have that actual photo in your head. Rather, every time you remember it, you're reconstructing it. And I could tell you one way or the other, and you'll remember it that way until you create some mnemonic to help you remember. So in this way, memory is constructive, like I was saying before, and it's largely gist-based. We remember the gists of things. We have our stories, we have our narratives, and then those dictate the way that we recall something later on. Another important thing to know about memory is that new learning is built on old learning. It's integrated with existing knowledge structures. So the more you know something, the easier it is to soak up new knowledge and information about it. If you're a novice at something, it's going to be a lot more challenging. This also goes against this idea that there's this limit. There isn't. As far as we know, there really isn't a limit to how much overall knowledge. You just continuously accumulate more information in there, and you're able to embed more information within that. That's why experts can continue to learn even as other cognitive faculties start to become less effective. This is not to say there aren't important limitations. There are. So one limitation that is important to emphasize is retrieval strength versus storage strength. So whereas on one hand, learning or storage strength, that does accumulate, and doesn't seem to be as limited. Our ability to retrieve something at a given time is incredibly limited. And we may not be able to retrieve something. That doesn't mean it's not in there. We just don't have the right cues to get at it, or maybe there are other things in the way. So this is just a little background just to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about memory and how it works. So how can we improve memory? What enhances learning? Engaging in active elaboration and construction. So one of the best things you can do if you want to remember something, just create something, create an idea, make a connection to what you already know. If you do that, you're going to be much more likely to remember it later on. If you can connect it to something you personally know that's personally meaningful to you, you may never forget it. But if you just try to repeat something, that's not going to work. And there's also this concept of desirable difficulties. I won't go through them in detail, but basically, the more difficult you make something, the more you force someone to engage in an effortful processing of that information, the more likely they're going to be able to remember it later on. If you make learning feel easy and fluent, you have this illusion that you're learning, but you're not. And in fact, you're not building that storage strength, and you're not going to be able to retrieve things later on. And as we'll see, this is a big problem in the context of technology, because what do you think technology is designed to do? Yeah, it's designed to make things easy for you, which may be robbing you of those desirable difficulties. And I like to point to this one study I did a while back on the benefits of highlighting. For reasons I won't get into, we were really arguing about whether highlighters were good for learning or not. And we separated people who thought highlighters were amazing for learning. They always use them. They hated to study without them. Those who hated highlighters thought they were the worst thing and didn't help learning. Guess who benefited from using highlighters? The people who hated them. Why? Because it made them do something new and different. You're always reading without highlighters. Now you have to. Now you're thinking about, why am I highlighting this? Why am I not? You're engaging in this more meaningful processing. Pro highlighters, it doesn't matter. They're doing that no matter what. Or in fact, as you can see there, they're really not doing as much to begin with, although that's another talk. So, all right. Questions about any of this so far? Just basic intro for memory. It's all seems intuitive. Yeah. Highlighters, like, when you're reading a text and you have like a yellow thing that marks it. Also, underlining is a similar thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Bullet point there is to create something new and meaningful.
Sure. So if an example of the first line of create something meaningful. So if I was going to try to remember someone's name, I might take that name and connect it to someone from my childhood who I knew really well. Now, every time I just have that image of that person, it would remind me of that name. So if I was trying to remember the name Todd, for example, I would remember my friend Todd, and that would help me in this context. That's maybe not the best example. The more deep and elaborate, the better it's going to be. But that sort of quick mnemonic will be helpful. Yeah. I think it's if something's difficult to start with, you may not have motivation to continue. Is that the question? I just tried to repeat
to continue with it.
Yeah.
Why continue if you don't want to?
Right.
Yeah, if it's difficult to start with.
Yeah. That's the problem. That's why people don't do this. So we know this is effective for learning, but people avoid them at all cost. And there's not many incentives to design things that create them. And that's a challenge. All right.
I see you've switched to learning as opposed to memory. Do you have programs at UCSC where you're helping students with these concepts to help them learn?
I hope so. Yeah.
How do people who have photographic memories fit into this scheme?
Oh, does anyone have photographic memory in this room? Oh, maybe? Little?
Yes,
Yeah.
almost my whole life.
Yeah. Um, so it's something that there's a lot of debate about what it means to have photographic memory. And my understanding is is how it's displayed on TV is not quite accurate in terms of how it actually works. I don't know how your experience of it is in general, but uh, yeah, oftentimes there's trade-offs in everything. So one thing you find is that people who do have much better visual memory for things, they might not encode other aspects of an experience in the same way. And so there's just there's trade-offs with memory. I think I need to retake control and to move on. All right. Because I want to talk about technology and how technology is affecting memory. And this is something, like I said, I was kind of dragged into. And to start with, I was pretty optimistic. I thought, you know, technology is good. It's going to help us, right? I thought it was cute that my daughter was playing with an iPod at 1. Now I'm, you know, shocked. Oh no, this was not cute. Maybe this was really problematic. There's books written about how Google and the internet are making us stupid, and others how it's, you know, making us have other potential. So we really don't know. And meanwhile, society is changing. You know, we're having AI classes and other things. It's becoming embedded in everyday life. So it seems like an important question to try to answer. It's not the first time, and apologies to those of you who have seen this quote. But I think it's informative. So has anyone seen this one before? This discovery will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls. They will not use their memories. They will trust to the external and not remember of themselves. They will be hearers of many things, will have learned nothing. They will appeal to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. So is this written by some anti-tech person about AI, the internet? Yeah, this is Socrates. 2,400 years ago, and ironically, of course, this is not Socrates' writing. This is Plato, because Socrates refused to write because of this. But there was a fear that it was going to change our cognition. It was going to change the way we interact with each other. And a lot of people cite this as, oh yeah, it's all overblown. They were worried about this, and look how great writing is. In a lot of ways, writing has done amazing things, but it probably has also changed the way we remember and tell stories and do other aspects of cognition. So it's interesting to know that we've been dealing with this for a long time. Another famous example is Einstein and Edison. Edison, I guess, was kind of a meanie head. I don't know. He would have this test, and then they had this rivalry. And there's this story of in order to get this a job, you had to pass the Edison test. And so they were giving questions to Albert Einstein, and he famously just said, yeah, "I don't know the speed of sound," which just seemed ridiculous that Einstein wouldn't know that. And he said that that's what books are for. You know, education's about training the mind to think. And this is connecting to this idea of cognitive offloading, that, you know, if we really want to enhance cognition and creativity, we need to expand what the mind can do. And just storing bits of information is not necessarily the best way to do that. Really, we need to have access to information and know how to integrate and synthesize and innovate from that. So this is an old debate that has continued. And then more recently, this is an example you probably have not seen. In the late 90s, people were concerned about the internet, and people will believe anything that's on the internet. So they created this fake website of the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, which was endangered, being hunted by Sasquatch. And they asked, they didn't tell people to use this, but they created the website and then asked students to go and do a book report on the octopus. And almost all of them just did it and believed it was real. And this was supposed to be alarming. And of course it is, although, I think it's even worse now. If ChatGPT suddenly started telling everyone that the sun goes around the earth and that there's no such thing as elephants or something like that, probably a lot of people would start believing that too, because we have so much trust implicitly in these things. And what's really weird is we're getting more trust in these things while our beliefs in our own abilities are becoming heightened despite any evidence that they're actually better. So this was a study done by Nate Fisher and colleagues. They had people either answer a question with the help of Google or just on their own. So for example, why do we have leap years? And you got the internet to help you answer that question and explain it, or you had to do it on your own. Then they asked you completely different questions about a completely different topic. Why are there more Atlantic hurricanes in August and September? How do tornadoes form, et cetera? Things that most people really can't explain very well. You have this sense that you know it, but it's hard. And what they found is that if you had used the internet to answer some other question, you now thought you were more confident in your ability to explain it internally without the internet, these other questions. And it just basically anything, you just thought you were better at knowing things and explaining things despite having no evidence that you actually did. So it's leading to this overconfidence in our own beliefs and our trust in this information that's got to us, and we don't really critically think. So you can see how this is creating a recipe for a very problematic relationship with technology that I believe has as much as it's fun to use these AI chatbots, they're probably going to make this worse, right? Because of the fluency with which we use them. So are our concerns overblown? Maybe we're underappreciating them. I don't think we know. I think it's difficult to know. We haven't known for much of the last 20 years, although now, very recently, the evidence seems to be accumulating that there is this really, that there are these negative impacts, that there is an erosion of deep encoding and internal deliberation, that we aren't remembering the things that we have access to online, and that we're not engaging in deep processing, that our attention is becoming fragmented. There's a pretty well-documented effect that the younger generations can't maintain attention for the same amount of time. And that's changing the way media is now given to us. Reduced executive control abilities, impaired source monitoring, all of these are more and more evidence is being observed. Now, there is an important limitation, is that a lot of that research that's been showing these things are cohort effects. And cohort effects are very difficult because there's a lot of other differences between the cohorts. So, for example, people who use the internet a lot show attention problems. Well, what came first, right? Maybe you have attention problems and therefore you're more likely to rely on the internet or become addicted to using the internet or your devices. And almost no studies have experimentally manipulated people's use of technology because there's obviously ethical problems with that sort of experimentalization. So the evidence that we have for the long-term effects are very limited, and they're suggestive, but I think we need to be cautious in how we interpret them. My lab's approach has been different. So I don't do any research on sort of the long-term consequences of use, but rather how are we using it, and are we using it in ways that seems to be working against us? So just trying to take more of a view about that, and we'll see what kind of it aligns with. Are people using it in a way that seems to be beneficial for memory and cognition, or are they doing it in a way that isn't? Okay. One concept that's important to know in this context is this idea of a transactive memory system. And this was starting off with the idea that maybe this is just an expansion or extension of the human mind, and it could have potential positive sides if used effectively. Historically, we've always offloaded. We've always relied on others to remember. We've had systems of other people. We've had communities. We've had books. We've always been having access to things in the world where we would be able to use that information. And these sort of transactive memory systems are not new. And what they've shown is that people don't need to remember a fact if they know where to find that fact. So I don't need to know anything about how to fix a car if I have my brother-in-law who knows everything, and when I have an issue, I know that he'll be able to fix that. Similarly, if we think of the internet as a transactive memory partner, I don't need to know something because it will be available online. And so I can call upon my best buddy, Google, who can then tell me that information. And so there was this idea that maybe this is going to be leading to a change in how memory functions, that we're no longer remembering things internally because we can offload and rely on the internet to remember for us. The first study to really explore this was done by Betsy Sparrow and colleagues back in 2011. And it was a very simple study. They brought people in the lab. They told them a bunch of facts like an ostrich's eye is bigger than its brain, and the Space Shuttle Columbia just integrated during re-entry over Texas, February 2003. So facts that were kind of mildly interesting to people, but weren't likely well known. And then participants either pressed save or they pressed erase in order to remove the fact from the screen. And in other ones, they typed it in. There's various different versions. The bottom line is that they found that if you erased a fact, you are more likely to remember it later on than if you saved a fact. And why? Because if you save it, you assume, okay, computer's got it, I don't need it. You don't engage in deep encoding, you don't remember it. Whereas if you think it's going to be erased, you do engage in those internal processes. The other thing they showed is that even if you erased it, you tended to remember that it was erased. And I mean, if you saved it, you remembered that you did save it and you remembered what file you saved it in on your computer. Although I don't know if that replicated. But this was the story that this is a way that we're engaging in transactive memory. Now, this had a big impact. All of a sudden, there was news stories everywhere. And Sparrow was being interviewed, and it was an exciting finding. The next several labs that tried to replicate it couldn't. And they could not find this effect. They just found no difference in memory. And there was a question of why. Now, imagine you're an undergrad and you're told, all right, here's this fact. Press this button for deleting it and for saving it. You have to believe that instruction. And for these participants believed it. But what we think happens is, and when people try to replicate this, participants just don't believe it. They're very suspicious of experimenters. But in the natural use of technology, you trust it. Like if you can find something online now, you think you're going to be able to find it online tomorrow. If something's on your computer, you trust that it will be there tomorrow. So I think there was a mismatch in how people were experimentally trying to study this in the lab and in the natural situations. My student at the time, Joel Schooler, tried to test this idea to show that it could be a robust and replicable effect if you were trusting the saving process. And so he created a reliable condition and an unreliable condition where you experience the computer to give you the facts back in an initial practice trial, or an unreliable condition where it gave you this error message, didn't work, and then here, save this other fact. And he found that you get this nice, big, robust Google effect, or digital amnesia effect is the name that's really stuck. Whereas if it's unreliable, you don't. So this is evidence that people are using this computer as a transactive memory partner. And as long as you believe that it's being saved, you seem to be less likely to remember it. The other thing that Joel found is that it didn't matter what the topic was. So you found this digital amnesia effect for every topic that we created facts about, and regardless of whether people found the facts interesting or not. So it's not so much as, oh, I'll save that, but I'm really interested in it. You still forget it. So there doesn't seem to be any protection from it. Okay. Now we've shown this in a number of other ways as well. Here's another example. This was a study done by another grad student of mine, Mercedes Oliva. And what Mercedes did is ask, well, you know, those are like facts. What about our own ideas? Presumably our own ideas are going to be protected, that we're going to not want to just completely offload those. And so she had people generate ideas either with or without the help of the computer, either with or without the help of the internet, to see whether people would once again fail to be able to remember their own ideas if they generated them with the help of the internet. And there's good reasons to think that the digital amnesia effect would replicate under those conditions. If you're coming up with an idea with the help of the internet, are you really engaging in the kind of deep and elaborative processes that help memory? Probably not. And maybe the ideas you generate are not really connected to your knowledge structures that you already have, right? Because they're, by definition, partly external. And so there's good reasons to think that there wouldn't be a protection in this context. So she used a task called the alternative uses task, and it's a very simple task. You're just given an object like a brick, and you're asked, come up with new ways to use this, new, unusual, alternative uses. And people can get very creative with it, and it's one of the most popularly used tasks in the study of creativity. Critically, participants either did this with the internet or without. Without getting into the details of the study, there was two main findings. One is people were a bit more creative when they used the internet. Why? Because they probably found more unusual ideas that they wouldn't have thought of otherwise, but they were terrible at remembering them. Even a few minutes later, they couldn't remember the ideas that they had come up with the help of the internet. Another example that people often talk of with transactive memory and offloading is photo taking. People take a lot of photos these days. They've got their phones in their pocket. I've already seen probably hundreds of photos taken in this lecture alone. Just people love taking photos. And one thing we know is that there's various reasons for taking photos, and that seems to matter to some extent. But a lot of people believe that you are in some ways recording that experience, recording that event, and therefore offloading memory onto that device. So you don't need to remember internally as much. This idea motivated Linda Henkel to study this in 2014, where she had students go through a museum tour and either take photos of some exhibits or not for other exhibits, and then measured memory of those museum exhibits. And what she found has come to be known as the photo taking impairment effect, that people are less likely to remember the things that they photograph than the things that they don't. If you just observe something and you remember it better than if you photograph it. And you see this effect even if you control for total time, even if you have someone come in, take a photo, and then observe for the same amount of time that you would have just observed, you still see a reduction. So it's not just a dual task thing. There's something about photo taking that is cueing people to engage in cognitive processes that are less likely to lead to memory. My student at the time, Julia Suarez, was not very happy with this explanation. It's one of these things like, yes, of course, cognitive offloading could happen. I definitely take pictures of where I parked and other, codes and other, that is effective offloading. We know that. But are you really doing that with experiences that you're photoing or at a museum tour, or is there something else going on? And we put forward what we call the attentional disengagement hypothesis, this idea that photo taking disrupts how you're experiencing a moment. It takes you out of the moment. Now you're in this different cognitive mode of taking the picture. It's not just a dual task thing, but you are no longer encoding that experience in the same way if you were just living the moment. This makes very different predictions about when and why we would see a photo taking impairment effect. One obvious way to test between these two is to have people's expectations of whether a photo is going to be saved. So Julia had the great idea of using Snapchat, and Snapchat at the time was very popular for having like photos where you take and you send them and then they disappear after 7 seconds. So people who took photos knew they were not going to be available to them later on. They take the photo, but it would no longer be available. Under this condition, you shouldn't engage in offloading, right? You should have no expectation of that photo being available for later study. It's only, whereas an intentional disengagement account would predict it doesn't matter why you're taking the photo. You're taking the photo, it's going to disrupt memory. So she did this in a number of different ways, including creating a simulated museum in our lab, which was really fun. And then participants went through, they either observed paintings or they took photos or they took Snapchat photos, and they were asked questions about the paintings that they had photographed, very similar to what Henkel had done. And what she found was that if it was offloading, we would have expected in the Snapchat condition for memory to go up as if it was just observe, but it didn't. In fact, it got worse. So there's no expectation of it being saved, but just now it's almost worse to even think you're taking a photo for the purposes of Snapchat led to even worse memory than just taking the photo in of itself. In a subsequent experiment, we replicated this and had people actually delete the photo to make sure they understood that they wouldn't have access to it. And you still get the photo taking impairment effect. So it doesn't, it's one of these stories like you want to believe it's all offloading and it's effective and it's strategic, but no, it seems like it's something a little bit more basic that you're not attending to the moment. Julia then followed it up with several other studies that really emphasize this. So she found that if you take multiple photos, it actually magnifies the effect. So she asked someone to take 5 photos versus 1 versus 0, and taking 5 photos actually led to worse memory than taking 1 photo, which is weird, right? Because you would think taking 1 photo has this negative effect, and then it's continuously, but it's this negative impact, and it gets a little bit worse. People are completely unaware of it. So if on all those studies, we asked people at the end, you took photos of some things and you didn't of others. Do you think it helped your memory? And they reliably 3 times as many participants said it helped my memory. They really believed that taking the photos, they were going to remember those things better. And we showed that more empirically here, where we allowed people to choose what they photograph. You still see a photo taking impairment effect, but they are drastically overconfident in their memory for the things that they photograph. So this technology is creating this illusion of encoding and memory, even though it might be having this reduction. Now one caveat is, of course, is if you take a photo, you get the photo, and so you could review it. There's no question that that's a very powerful memory cue. But the other thing research shows is that people don't look at 95% of the photos they take. But at least it's there. And I can't argue with that. One other area of work that we're doing is how people over rely on technology as a transactive memory partner. So why do people choose to use it? So if I give you a trivia question like, when was Santa Cruz incorporated as a town? Just give me a decade. Anyone know? 1860s. Good. It was 1866. So you probably all engaged in some sort of cognitive process trying to see if you had that information. And I think increasingly people that are becoming more reliant on technology, their mind just goes, where's my phone? Right? They don't engage in thinking. They just engage in where can I get that information? And they do this, I'm going to argue, even when they know the information, which is problematic. And I'm going to call this the internet fixation effect, because we're getting fixated on the internet as providing this information. I think it's going to be even worse with these AI chatbots because they're so much easier to get information. One way we studied this is using a paradigm where we had a first phase where we gave people difficult trivia questions. They either had to answer them from memory or they were to use the internet, or we had a baseline where they didn't do anything. I'm not showing the baseline here. And these were difficult questions. So for undergrads, what was the first American state to secede from the Union? What happened October 29th, 1929? What did King John sign in 1215? I know most of you know those. Those are, we piloted, and the vast majority of undergrads were not able to answer those questions. So we knew that they were going to use the internet. Now, 19% were able to answer them. So they were pretty difficult. And we did that to ensure that they actually used the internet to answer them. And the reason we did this is we wanted to prime the internet. Now, we know everyone comes in fixated on the internet, but now it's like, okay, this is a thing you can do in the internet condition. Next, in phase 2, we gave them 10 easy trivia questions. So these are trivia questions that we had piloted, and we knew that almost all undergrads would be able to answer. So what sport uses a foil? What is the center of a hurricane called? What does an entomologist study? How many zodiac signs are there? They're not like, you know, the easiest, but they're the things that most people know that are part of people's general knowledge that most people would just be able to answer from memory correctly. And the question is, how would these two conditions, people who had been in the internet condition versus the memory condition, how would they differ in their likelihood to choose to use the internet in this phase 2? So that now we actually gave them the option, said, you can just answer from memory, or you can do a Google search. And in some conditions, we made it really annoying. Like they had to use a really old Apple iPod and they had to walk over off the couch and go to another room to get it. We tried to create barriers and frictions to make it difficult to use the internet. 83% of the time they used the internet, even if they had to get up off the couch, go to a different room, open a device, Google it to find out how many zodiac signs there were. Now, 60% in the baseline condition is already pretty high, but 83% is even higher. So I find that remarkable. Other things we found is the amount of time they thought about things before they clicked the search button. And it went from 3.76 seconds to 2.22. So the time between the question being displayed and the beginning of a Google search was 2 seconds. I don't know, not a lot of cognition going on there. And we asked people at the end, we gave them a scale for a need for cognition scale. This is how much people like to cognitively challenge themselves. It's supposed to be a pretty stable thing, but even that was affected. So it was significantly lower in the internet condition than the baseline. So people became less likely to just want to cognitively challenge themselves. And we think this is leading to a kind of offloading induced complacency where the people are just, I don't need to try. I'll just use the internet. More recent work, this was done by Donnelly Spittner and Mercedes as well, extended this to a Wikipedia-like situation. And the idea here was to see whether people would continue to use digital devices as a transactive memory partner, even when it was a bad one, even when it failed. So she created these simulated Wikipedia sites, made them look really real, this one's about skyscrapers, and then created different versions of them where you got a bunch of questions about skyscrapers and you could either answer 0, 3, 6, or all 9 questions using the Wikipedia article. So in the 0 condition, it just had a bunch of other information, but was completely uninformative and unhelpful for answering the questions that were given. And people repeatedly had to go back to it, have it fail to provide accurate information or helpful information over and over and over again. And we thought maybe if people are using their transactive memory partners strategically, they would learn not to trust Wikipedia, at least in the context of our experiment, in that 0 condition, or even the 3 condition, that they would only really trust it in the 9. And we did that by having people come back, and it was sometimes a different topic, sometimes the same topic, but now they got the choice of whether to use Wikipedia before answering a question. This time it's about big cats, or it could be about skyscrapers. And what we found is it made no difference. So here was the baseline level at which people wanted to use Wikipedia in a baseline condition. And if they had used Wikipedia in the prior phase, they were substantially more likely to continue to use it. And it didn't matter whether it was actually useful or not. Other work that's done by my former student, Julia, more recently has shown that even when if people are using AI chatbots and they provide you wrong information, you still go back to it. And even if you don't trust it, you still go back to it. So this fixation effect seems to be so strong that even if you know it's not providing the best information, you can't help but continue to use it. So my lab hasn't really gotten into the generative AI work yet. It's all been very fast, and it's kind of making this other stuff pale in comparison. And I think it's just worth talking about some of the differences and why we might be more concerned about it. One is that there's a shift from passive repository to an active partner. The internet was just there. We could access information from it. We had some choice in what we choose to get from it. With AI, it's very different. Right now, it's actually synthesizing things for us, and it's predicting what we want. It's increasingly embedded in everyday contexts, so it's increasingly unavoidable. And it's exacerbating metacognitive effects. So it gives this seamless, fluent answer. It's so confident. And that's going to probably heighten these metacognitive illusions or metacognitive mirages that we have about our own personal knowledge. We think we know something because we are using this AI chatbot and coming to this conclusion. We're going to think our ideas are even better. And we're going to think we're going to remember them, even though we're probably not. And AI, this is a little bit different, makes it possible to organize and search through more of our past than ever before. And I think this is going to have really important implications for who we are. Who are we when so much of our digital selves is suddenly accessible and actionable? It used to be that we could create so much data, but no one could do anything with it. Now with these AI systems, they can. And so I think there's new risks that we need to be aware of. One thing that often brought to my attention is this, here's people on a bus reading the newspaper all locked in, not talking to each other. Is that any different than what's going on with these phones? I think yes. I think it is very different. The phone, the newspaper, you could put it down. You choose what's in there. Everyone's collectively engaged in the same thing. It's very different. In this world, the technology is pinging you. It's having these short form videos and these texts that's just designed to capture your attention. And it's not because you want it, it's because it wants to keep you captured. And I think these technologies are, it is different. And without intervention, they're going to likely capture, we're going to become more and more captured by them. All right. So some final thoughts. I really do believe technology can be used to enhance cognitive performance and enable innovation. There's no question about that. And my talk has been focused more on some of the potential negative side effects of that, but I think it's important to also point out that there are a lot of benefits. And the negative effects are things we need to be aware of, though. Someone might argue that the effects might be small, like, so you remember a fact 10% less well. Okay, but they compound. And if you think about developing expertise and developing storage strength, every iterative bit reduces that compounding of knowledge over a lifetime. It can also be difficult to know how you're being affected. People don't know, and often they think that they're not, or they're actually benefiting. And I would argue that we can use technology effectively and in a way that's adaptive for us, but we need to be intentional about how we design it. And we have to be intentional about how we use it and really understand those effects. The challenge is going to be to try to align designer incentives with user experience and how people learn and remember, because people don't necessarily want the things that are going to be best for their learning and memory. And a lot of companies who are developing these technologies, they want to better capture people's attention. So it's a very big challenge that I think as a society we're going to have to figure out. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So there are a million questions. I know. I'll try to get around to everybody.
I'm curious about the connection between music and memory. Need some comments about that, or
Just in general?
why is it that I can remember something I hadn't listened to in over 30 or 40 years,
Yeah.
and on a lucky day I can even remember the title? So
Yeah, that's a bit outside of my expertise, but it does seem to be that memory had developed initially with music in mind, or at least melody, like how we talk and how we create things. So I think that's not too surprising, but it also matters what era. So there seems to be like a critical time period, like of your life where you remember music a lot better. And as you don't, it brings you back to like your 20s more so than maybe your 40s. But it's a fascinating area of work that I wish I knew more about to tell you about.
It's about photographs. You've talked about taking the photograph in terms of the facts that are contained within that photo. Yet, one of the things that photos do, I think, for a lot of people, is to trigger memory, so that you've got a photo of something that you might say, oh, I had forgotten about that.
Yeah.
And it can pull up all the sights, the emotions, the whatever you actually experienced or you remember experiencing when that photo was taken, which is different from what your cognitive testing
Yeah,
seems to be doing.
I think that's a wonderful point. And there's no doubt that photos are extremely powerful cues for memory, that it really can take you back into that moment and remember things that you wouldn't otherwise. And I think that's absolutely true. At the same time, if you're being taken out of the moment, you might not have those experiences to be taken back to nowadays. So it's complicated. Also, we know from research that photographic review can ironically cause you to forget aspects of an experience because you're selectively reconstructing it in a way that you know now, but your eyes are different now than they were when that photo was taken. And so it actually can damage or impair the original experience. So it's fascinating. All in all, it's a net positive if you do review in terms of cueing the memory, but it's a more complicated and nuanced effect.
That study that you showed about going back to Wikipedia, even if you had a bad experience or a negative experience with it, there are different authors of things on Wikipedia, and there's different AIs. So even if you go to one that didn't give you the right information, that doesn't necessarily inform your decision to use that program again, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it'd be more persuasive if we were able to show that repeated with multiple authors, this whole platform was unreliable and you continued to use it. But I think that's a reason why people would continue, even despite some limited unsuccess. I think that's a fair point.
okay.
Have you done any experiments, or is anybody experimenting at looking at the long-term implications and whether or not it's reversible if you sort of went on a digital diet?
Yeah, I think there have been some limited studies on that where they've shown improvements in cognitive function and attention if people digital detox, I think they call it. I'm always a little cautious interpreting those because there's always dropout effects. So the people who start a detox and finish it are different than those that don't finish it. And so you can get what looks like an improvement just because you have a more select sample of people who were able to get around it. And if you kind of control for that, some of the effects become more questionable, but there's no reason to think that there wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to undo some of this, especially for people who grew up in a more analog world. I think the other question is, if you grew up with this digital mindset, you know, are there ramifications for the development of the cognitive system that are more difficult to undo? And I think that's a completely open but really important question.
You spoke of intentional fragmentation increasing with technology usage. I was wondering if there's has been a measured benefit in context switching, multitasking. Sorry.
Well, I didn't have time to include it here, but one thing we've shown is that if you, the question was attentional fragmentation and if whether there's benefits to.
Do you see in this younger generation that's been using this technology in terms of context switching successfully, multitasking over a larger number of?
Yeah,
or has there been no improvement?
I've heard both. I've heard some people argue that younger adults are better at doing this multi-attention. I'm skeptical though. I think we have an illusion of it. We think we're multitasking well, but we're not. And because you do this with almost everyone, there's so much research showing that people think they're able to do better with two things at once, but they're doing it worse.
Have you done any experiment after a meditation, whether the memory enhances and recollections of the stories are easier?
No, I've not done. I'm trying to remember if I've read any studies about that. I don't know. But yeah. I mean, there was all the work on mindfulness and how that would affect memory. And there's some evidence that I think it changes how you remember and what you remember. But I don't know about it in connection to this. Yeah.
So I'm a retired historian from UCSC. And so I think what I just heard is could be thought of as evidence for voting for the Historians Full Employment Act. Is that correct?
Though I couldn't understand what.
He said something about what you just said is evidence for in promoting the Historians Unemployment Act.
Oh.
Free employment.
Full Employment Act. Oh, now I got it, Terry. Okay. Listen, there's so many people who want to talk and have questions, and we're running out of time, but I'm going to try a few more, and then we'll see what we do.
I really enjoy this presentation. It's great. It has so much new information, but I have a question in that you have done this with college students, and right in this room, you have a huge sample population. Are you going to take advantage of us?
Good question.
If we created a study, how many people would want to participate?
Oh, many.
Well, that's all the more reason to do it. I think it's really important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. You talk about memory, but you are not distinguishing between short-term and long-term memory.
Yeah.
And that's something I think is very important, especially for this age group.
Yeah. Pretty much everything I've talked about is long-term memory. So that's what I focus on studying. But the effects of short-term memory has a long history in memory research. Like it's kind of complicated where people were just studying it as remembering lists of information. Of course, that's not how people actually use short-term memory in everyday settings. And so I think perhaps the better connection is working memory capacity or how people flexibly use attention and keep things in that short-term store. And I would put that in the category of how people attend. And I think that is something that has also been the focus of a lot of work on how technology is affecting that as well. Because you are seeing this reduction in how much people seem to be able to not just maintain in short-term memory, but actively use and connect to long-term memory, which is a big part of cognition and learning.
I'm guessing a lot of us here have grandkids. I've got two granddaughters, ages 4 and 7. I see them with their iPads all the time. And I'm just wondering, what does the research show on how this impacts them in the school setting?
Yeah, this has been mostly focused on strategic use of offloading and memory, but then there's just, I think this YouTube videos, the constant notifications, these games that are designed to grab your attention, and I think one of the biggest things that we're missing is just empty space and time to think. And so I worry about kids, and they're spending so many hours, and it's just constant being exposed to these things that it's robbing them of those opportunities for real cognitive growth and neural thinking, and I think we don't really know what the consequences of that are going to be, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be good. So that's my intuition. And it's something I've had to navigate with two kids, who are 11 and 16 now. And it's really hard because you're fighting against it. They really want it. Yeah, I think that's another way that we could think about doing some of this is research is not just like, what are the effects of when you use it, but what is it taking away? And how much are people becoming isolated from others? How much are they not engaging in things that they would have engaged? Otherwise, that would have been far more beneficial for their well-being and cognition.
So I have a data point for you. So I've been an amateur photographer since I was 16. So I have obviously many, many pictures and tens of thousands of pictures over my lifetime. But what I do technically is I edit my photos that I take on a thing after, maybe a week after, maybe a month after. And there's where I select the pictures that will go in wherever my thing is going to go to, and those that are on my wall. But the main factor in that is if I like them. So that's another parameter that if you're going to do any studies about photographs, or that if you like the thing that's a pleasant memory, or maybe not, but if it's a memory that you embody in it from the thousands or hundreds of thousands of pictures you take in your lifetime, you will remember that. At least that's my experience. I can tell you the day it was taken. I can tell you what I was wearing, what the weather was.
Yeah.
That detail.
Yeah, I think it would be great. This is a question we get a lot, especially from amateur or professional photographers, and we really don't know whether these findings replicate with them. And there's good reasons to think it wouldn't, that they're taking photographs in a fundamentally different way. And especially if they're engaging in that kind of review process, the impact's going to be very different. So I think that makes sense.
This time is up, and there are so many questions here. This is really, I feel like I'm being cruel and miserable to you all. But we do have a responsibility to restore this room for the use of the cafeteria at the end. So I want to just say thank you, Ben. That was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Now, I do have something else to say. And there's no one with a hook. Okay. I always say that we have a reputation at the university as being the group that uses this space the cleanest. We'll look around on the floor and make sure that your cups and anything else you have end up in one of the two containers there.